So if you look at any plant, right, so the most attractive part of a plant will be its flower, right? So why is flower the most attractive part of a plant is something that we are going to study in this chapter. Then from this flower we get fruit. Right? What is the process using which flowers get converted to fruit is again something that we are going to study. This fruit then contains the seeds, right? And seeds helps in formation of new plants. Okay, so this entire process we are going to study in this topic on flowers and fruits. Before we jump into this topic, I want you to think about this. Can every flower become a fruit? So we have four flowers here: rose, sunflower, mango flower, and apple flower. Right? Do all of them gets converted to fruit, or are there some flowers that get converted, some of them do? Right? So think about this, but we'll have an answer towards the end of this chapter. Okay. First of all, why do plants have flowers? Okay, just like we studied in the previous topics, plants have stems, right? Plants have roots, plants have leaves because they had certain specific purposes without which the plants are not able to survive. Right? Similarly, plants have flowers because flowers has certain functions without which plants won't be able to survive. What are those functions? The most important function of a flower is that it helps the plants to reproduce. So flowers are also known as the reproductive part of a plant because it helps them in formation of new plants. Okay, so flowers contain the parts that makes new plant possible. So there is a process behind that we are going to study in the subsequent slides. Right, so it is the flower that gets converted to fruit, and then the fruit contains the seeds, and this seeds gives rise to new plants. Right, what are other sub processes? So they are these. The first is it attracts insects and birds. Without insects, this formation of flower to fruit won't be possible. Right, so bright colors, flowers have bright colors, they have sweet smell, and they have nectar. Right, so that you must have heard bees collecting nectars. Right, so these are something that attracts these insects and birds. So these are collectively known as pollinators. Right, and this process is known as pollination. So again, not going too deep here because we have already covered this in the subsequent slides. Then this is the flower that gets converted to fruit. Right, so this is another function. Without flower, we don't have fruit. And without flower, since we don't have fruit, we'll not get seeds. Right, so fruits have seeds that can grow into new plants. So overall, plants have flowers because it helps them to form new plants through reproduction. Right, otherwise it would not be possible. Let us see some uses of flowers. So they are not just beautiful, they are also very useful in our daily lives. Right, the first purpose is they serve as food. Right, we have some of the flowers as vegetables. For example, cauliflower, broccoli. So these are examples of flowers as food. Right, we also use flowers for decoration. For example, rose and marigold. Right, they are also used for medicines. So there are a lot of flowers that are used for medicines. So I've just put two such examples: calendula and saffron. They are also used in perfumes or fragrances. Right, for example, jasmine and lavender. Right, so these are some of the uses of flowers that we have in our daily lives. Now we are going to study about the parts of a flower. Right, so these are the parts that makes the flowers that so important for a plant. Right, each of the part has a specific job. If you look into this figure, there are a large number of parts, so it becomes difficult to understand what each part represents. So what we do is we group it into different categories. Right, so we have the male part, we have female part, and the accessory organs or the accessory parts of a flower. Right, so the male part is known as a stamen, female part is known as a carpel or a pistil, and then we have the accessory parts which are neither male nor female. Accessory parts means that they don't have any role to play in the reproduction, but they are an important component of a plant because they have a very important role to play. Okay, now you'll notice that some plants just have the female part, just some plants just have the male part, while there are some plants that have both male and female parts. Right, so it can be possible that a plant contains both the male part and the female part. So which is here in the example that we are looking into. Okay. Now let us study the accessory parts first. Right, the first accessory part is the petal. Right, so petals are brightly colored and they attract insects and birds. So if you look into a flower, so that is the petal that makes it look so attractive. And again, why? Because it is to attract the insects and birds. Okay, which are also known as pollinators. Then we have the sepal. So sepal are the green leafy parts that protect the flower bud. Right. So when you have a developing flower, right, which has not yet bloomed, right, so you'll see a structure like this. So it is the sepal that encloses the developing flower inside. Right. So these are the green leafy parts. And once the flower blooms, you'll see the sepal on the sides. Right. So this is the sepal. We also have two more accessory parts. One is the stalk. This is the stalk. And then you have slightly bulged portion. So this is the slightly bulged portion, which is known as the receptacle. Right. So stalk, what is a stalk? It connects the flowers to different parts of a plant. And what is this receptacle? It is the bulged portion that connects the upper part of a flower to the stalk. Right. So again, these are accessory parts of a flower. Now we can go to the male part. So accessory parts are the petals, sepal, receptacle, and stalk. Right. And we have seen the purpose of each of them. Now we are moving on to the male part. Right. So if you look into this male part, so these are all male parts of a flower. Right. So you have a large number of thread-like structures like this. Right. So these are the male parts. Right. So the first component is a filament. Right. So it is a thin stalk that holds the anther. Right. So it is a very thin thread-like structure. And what is the purpose? It holds this anther. Right. So this is the anther. Right. And what is this anther? So anther is the part that produces the pollen grains, small grains like this. Right. So this is how a pollen grain looks like. This is the flower that contains both the male part and the female part. So if you look into this, so this is the female part and then this is the male part, right? So if I just zoom in to this figure, so you can see the filament as well as the anther. So this is the filament, and then connected to the filament is the anther, which contains the pollen grains, small particles, right? So they are the most important part. So without pollen grains, we'll never have flowers getting converted to fruit. Okay. So again, male part, there are two male part. One is the anther, the other is the filament. So filament is the thin stalk that holds the anther, and anther is the part that produces the pollen grain. Okay. Then we come to the pistil or the carpel, also known as the female part. Right. So again, just like we had a thread-like structure, similarly we have a tube-like structure. Right. So this is the style. So it is known as the style. So this tube-like structure is known as the style. Okay, we'll come back to its purpose once we study these components, the other components as well. Okay, so we have the style. Then just like we had anther here, right? So just like we had filament, we had style, right? So this is the female counterpart of filament, right? And then we have this stigma. Stigma is the female counterpart to anther, right? So we have the stigma. So what is stigma? Stigma is a sticky top part that receives pollen. So this produces the pollen grain and it goes in this stigma. So stigma is sticky because pollens are grains or thin dust-like particles. So it has to be captured by the stigma. So if it is not sticky, then it would be carried away by this wind and it won't be able to capture the screen. Right? Now you may think the main purpose of petal, although it is not an accessory organ, I mean not a reproductive part of a plant, still we need it, right? Because it is the insect, it will not go on its own. First, it can be carried by wind, but at the same time it is also carried by insects. So insects, they sit on this and the pollen grain gets attached to their legs, and when they move to other plant, it carries it and then drops it on the stem. Right, so this is the purpose of insects. So they are also known as pollinators. Why? Because they carry pollen grains from one flower to another. Right, and that is why insects also play a major role in the fruits that we eat. Okay, so stigma is the sticky top part that receives the pollen grains. Style is a tube, right? So it connects stigma to this lower part. So lower part, we have two components. One is the ovary, the other is the ovule. So if you look at this swollen part, right? So this is the swollen part. So it is the ovary, right? And it is the ovary that develops into fruit, right? And you have this ovule. So these are small seeds inside this ovary that develops into seeds. Now you know which is the part that develops into fruit and which is the part that develops into seeds. So this bulged part or the swollen part, it gets converted to fruit, and this small seeds or the ovules, it gets converted to seeds after fertilization in plants. Okay, so again, just a quick revision. We had the accessory parts, which includes the petal, the sepal, the receptacle, and the stalk. We had the male part, which is also known as stamen, which contains the filament, which is a thread-like, thin thread-like structure, and an anther, which produces the pollen grains. Right? Then we have this stigma, right? Or the female parts, which contains the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. So it is the stigma that receives the pollen grains, and the pollen grains goes inside like this through this tube, which is the style, and the style contains this. The style basically connects the stigma to the ovary and the ovules. So it goes inside the ovary and then it fertilizes. So as a result of fertilization, this ovary gets converted to fruit and this ovule gets converted to seeds. Right. So this is how a bee pollinates a flower. Right. Pollinates means, so when a bee is sucking nectar from the flower, the pollen grains gets attached to their feet. Right. So what happens is that once they are done collecting nectar, they'll move to another plant or another plant and will sit on another flower wherein the pollen grain will be attached to the stigma, right? And then the pollen grain will go down and do the fertilization process. Now let us see how a flower gets converted to a fruit. So we have already seen that a flower can have either a male part or a female part or both, right? So we have a flower. What happens is that, say for example, an insect like a bee, right? It comes to the flower and then starts to suck nectar. Right? So the structure of the leg of a bee is such that it will have small hairs like this. Right? What are these hairs meant for? It is meant for collecting the pollen or pollen grains from the anther. Right? So what happens is that pollen from the anther, so it is collected by the hairs of the bee and then it falls into the stigma. How it may fall? Because, for example, it is collecting this pollen from its feet. Now, what may happen is that this bee may change its position in the same flower, or it may move to a different flower to suck nectar. In that process, we have already seen that stigma, it is the sticky part. So, it will collect that pollen from the feet of the bee. Right? So, this is how pollination happens. So, this process is known as pollination. So it can be either done by insects or by winds or even by birds. Right? So what is pollination? So pollen from the anther reaches the stigma. Right? So pollination is a process wherein pollen grains from the anther reaches the stigma. So this can happen with the help of insects like bees and even birds or winds. Now we come to the next step, which is the fertilization. Right? So pollen travels down the style to the ovary and joins with the ovules. So You have this pollen grain, it travels this passage or this tube known as style, wherein it reaches the ovary and then meets the ovule. So this process is known as fertilization. So pollination was the process wherein reaches the stigma from anther, whereas fertilization is the process wherein the pollen it joins the ovules, right? Once that fertilization happens, then fruit formation takes place. What is fruit formation? This ovary basically turns into fruit, and these small ovules they gets converted to seeds, right? What happens to the other accessory parts? They fall off, right? And all the other parts they fall off by drying, right? So the ovary grows bigger and turns into a fruit. Other parts of the flower dry up and fall off, right? Then this fruit has seeds inside, right? What is the purpose of the fruit? The fruit protects the seeds, and then these seeds can grow into new plants. Okay. So think about this. If a flower does not get pollinated, what will happen in that case? Now that we know how flowers get converted to a fruit, we'll try to see how flowers gives rise to a new plant. Right? So we have a flower that blooms on a plant. What happens is that because of pollination and fertilization, this flower gets converted to a fruit. Right? The fruit then contains seeds inside it. Right? When this seed falls on the soil, it grows. How will the seed come in contact with the soil? The fruit may fall on the ground, the outer layer may decompose, and because the seeds are protected with a hard covering, so that is why it does not decompose. The outer covering it decomposes, right? So then the seed may come in contact with the soil. What is other way? Birds or animals may eat the fruit and they may leave the seed in the soil, right? That is another way in which the seed comes in contact with the soil. So when these seeds fall on the soil, it grows into a new plant. Right? So not all the seeds grows into a new plant. It is only when they get the optimum environment for their growth, then only they can grow into a new plant. So this is the life cycle of a plant. So this is also known as the life cycle of a plant. What does it contain? We have a flower. The flower gets converted to fruit. Fruits have seeds, and then seeds gives rise to new plant. Right? So without seeds, new plants cannot grow. Although we have other methods that humans use to grow new plants, but this is one of the most important ways through which new plants grows. So not all the plants have flowers, right? So there may be some plants that do not contain flowers, right? So plants can be categorized into two main types based on whether they have flowers or not, right? So what are those two types? The first type is the flowering plant, the other type is the non-flowering plant. What are flowering plants? Flowering plants are the plants that have flowers, right? So these flowers help in the formation of fruits and seeds, right? And most flowering plants are either trees, shrubs, or herbs, right? So this is the categorization of plants that we have studied on the basis of stem, right? So most of the flowering plants are either trees, shrubs, or herbs. What are some of the examples? We have hibiscus, we have sunflower, we have rose, and we have mango. Now you might be wondering that I have mentioned that flowers help in the formation of fruits and seeds. But I have mentioned hibiscus, I have mentioned rose, I have mentioned sunflower as well. And we only see the flowers in them. We do not see the food of a hibiscus, right? But it turns out that we also have food from hibiscus, we also have fruit of rose, we also have fruit of sunflower. How do they look like? So for example, if you look at the fruit from rose, so it is this particular fruit that we get from rose, right? If you look at the fruit from hibiscus, we have this particular fruit that comes from hibiscus. And if you look into the fruit that comes from sunflower, it is the sunflower seeds that are the fruits that comes from sunflower. Okay, so that is why if you have a flower, then it will give rise to fruit. So now what are non-flowering plants? So non-flowering plants are the plants that do not have any flowers. So when they don't have any flowers, they'll not produce any fruits and seeds, right? So now you might be wondering, how do they give rise to new plants in that case? So they actually reproduce by spores. So all these plants, ferns, moss, pine, and horsetail, are examples of non-flowering plants, and they reproduce using spores, right? So sometimes you'll also see they reproduce by spores and cones. So we'll see pine as an example that it reproduces by cones. So it's nothing that the spores are just stored inside this cone-like structure, right? So that is what we mean when we say they reproduce by cones, right? So the spores are stored inside these cones in case of pine plants. Other than this, fern, moss, horsetail, what do they do is they have small spores. They are carried away by the action of wind into other parts of the forest, and once they come in contact with moist soil, what happens is that they start to germinate. Whereas in case of pine, we have male and female pine plant, and the spores of the male pine plant gets carried to the female pine plant, right? And the only difference is that the spores are stored in the cone-like structures. Okay, so these plants do not use seeds to make new plants; they use spores to make new plants. Okay, so this is the difference between a flowering and a non-flowering plant. Coming to fruits, right? We have already seen what fruits are. So it develops from flowers and it contains seeds. So many fruits develop from flowers. For example, we have a flower, we'll get a fruit from it, right? Now, why are fruits important? So fruit protects the seeds inside them for a long period of time, right? So because of this protection, seeds inside fruits can grow into new plants. Many animals and birds eat fruits and help in spreading these seeds, right? And many fruits are tasty and healthy too because they contain a lot of nutrients, right? So these are the importance of foods for us, right? Now, one thing that you may have noticed is that some fruits have one seed while some has many seeds, right? For example, mango, it has only one seed. Apple, it has many seeds, right? Although they are countable, but tomato, it has a larger number of seeds when compared to apple, and guava has again large number of seeds, right? So plants can be categorized, or the fruits can be categorized based on the number of seeds that they have, right? So a fruit can contain one seed or more than one seed. Okay, so fruits with one seed and fruits with many seeds. So what are some examples? We have mango that contains one seed, we have peach that contains one seed, we have lychee that contains one seed, right? Fruits with many seeds, we have papaya that contains many seeds, we have tomato that contains many seeds, and we have watermelon that contains many seeds. So different fruits have different number of seeds. You can try to think about few other examples of fruits that contains only one seed and fruits that contains many seeds other than the ones that we have discussed. So now let us go through some of the questions to check our understanding on this topic on flowers and fruits. Right, so the first question, the picture shows a flower. Which part of the flower develops into a fruit? Right, again, you can try to answer this question on your own. So pause this video, try to answer it, and then look at the solution that I'm discussing. So we have already seen that the ovary is the part that gets converted to a fruit, and the ovule gets converted to a seed. So ovary is the correct answer. So petal is an accessory part of a flower. What is stamen? Stamen is the male reproductive part of the flower that contains the anther and the filament, the thread-like structure. Right? What is sepal? Sepal is this part of the flower that encloses the flower during the developing stage. Right? Which of these fruits is different from the others? Right? We have tomato, we have apple, we have watermelon, we have mango. Right? So which of these is different from the other? So if you notice, tomato, it has many seeds, apple, it has many seeds, watermelon, it has many seeds. However, mango has only one seed. So mango is the correct answer. Okay. Next, we have this part of the flower that produces pollen grains is the, so what part of the flower produces the pollen grains? Right, so we have petal, it does not produce pollen grain. Stamen, sepal, and ovary. Sepal also is an accessory part, so it will not produce the pollen grain. Ovary is the part that gets converted to fruit, so it is not the correct answer. We have stamen. Stamen is the, so sometimes we'll get anther in the option, sometimes we'll get stamen in the option. So what is stamen? Stamen is the male reproductive part, so it contains both the filament, so this is the filament and the anther, right? So stamen contains the anther which produces the pollen grain. So if you are given stamen, stamen is the correct answer. Sometimes you may be given anther, so anther is also the correct answer because it is the anther inside the stamen that produces pollen grains. Right? A plant which does not have flower, right? Rose. I mean, we have the images as well, so it becomes easier. I'm just adding the images so that once you see the names, you are able to visualize while you are sitting in the exam. Right? So you have rose. It has flowers, so it is a flowering plant. It is a non-flowering plant, so this is the correct answer. Sunflower, it is a flowering plant, and mango tree, it is a flowering plant. Right? Which of the following shows the correct order in the life cycle of a plant? So we have already studied the life cycle of a plant. So it starts from flower, right? Then fruit, then seeds, and then new plant. So we have flower, then fruit, then seed, and then new plant. So B is the correct answer. If the seeds are not protected by the fruits, what might happen to them? So this is related to the function of fruit. Right? So if the fruit does not protect the seeds, the first thing is it may be eaten by animals. Right? It may be washed away by rain, right, to some other part wherein it is not getting suitable climate to grow. And it may not fall in good soil as well, right, as a result of this. Right? So the correct answer to this is all of the above. Okay. So this completes our chapter on flowers and fruits. So now we will move on to adaptation in plants.